Normandy, July 1944, a Wehrmacht Obergefreiter crouched behind what he thought was solid cover, a thick stone farmhouse wall that had sheltered French families for 2 centuries. Then, an American. 30-06 round, from an M1, Garand punched clean through 18 inches of aged limestone, the brick behind it, and took his helmet off without ever slowing down. In that instant, every assumption German infantry had made about defensive positions, about what constituted hard cover, shattered along with the masonry. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. You probably think you know this story. American firepower, German stubbornness, the inevitable outcome written in steel and industrial capacity. But what happened in the hedgerows of France between June and August 1944 wasn't just about who had more rifles or better logistics. It was about a fundamental miscalculation in German defensive doctrine, one that cost thousands of lives before anyone in the Wehrmacht High Command would admit the walls weren't thick enough anymore. The moment that changed everything happened on July 12, 1944, in a nameless hamlet 6 kilometers southwest of Saint-Lô. The village didn't even rate a name on American tactical maps, just a grid reference, 49.1145 degrees north, 1.1167 degrees west. 3 stone buildings, a cattle barn, and a well. Standard Norman construction, limestone blocks mortared together, walls built to last centuries, the kind of thick barriers that had stopped musket balls during the Napoleonic Wars and rifle fire in 1914. Hauptmann Köhler's 3rd Company, 353rd Infantry Division, had occupied these buildings for 16 days. They'd reinforced the positions exactly according to manual. Windows sandbagged from inside, firing ports chiseled through strategic points in the walls, overlapping fields of fire carefully calculated. The stone walls ranged from 35 to 50 centimeters thick, that's 14 to 20 inches of solid limestone. According to German field manuals dating back to 1937, that constituted secure hard cover against rifle-caliber ammunition. Köhler wasn't some fresh-faced officer straight from academy. He'd served since Poland, survived France, fought 2 winters on the Eastern Front. He knew fieldcraft. His defensive position was textbook perfect. The buildings formed a natural strongpoint controlling the intersection of 2 sunken roads. German machine guns, MG 42 seconds, were positioned to catch American infantry in crossfire the moment they emerged from the hedgerows. Mortar teams were pre-registered on likely approach routes. The Americans hit them at dawn with a platoon from the 2nd Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, the same unit that had bled on Omaha Beach 5 weeks earlier. They weren't coming in blind. Their scouts had watched Köhler's position for 2 days, mapped the firing ports, identified the machine gun positions. But the American approach confused Köhler's observers initially. Instead of massing for an assault, the American riflemen spread out in the hedgerows 80 meters distant, no bunching up, no obvious attack formation. Just individual soldiers and 2-man teams taking up firing positions behind the earthen embankments that lined every field in Normandy. Then they started shooting, not suppressing fire in the German understanding of it, random rounds to keep heads down while assault teams maneuvered. This was different. Methodical, aimed fire. Each American rifleman picked a firing port or a window and started putting rounds through it. The distinctive 8-round ping-ping-ping-ping-ping-ping-ping rhythm of M1 Garands echoed across the morning fields, overlapping, continuous. Gefreiter Wilhelm Brandt was manning a firing port in the main farmhouse, left side window, 2nd floor, 23 years old, from Dresden, conscripted in 1942. He'd been wounded twice on the Eastern Front. Nothing serious, shrapnel mostly. He knew how to keep his head down. His position was good thick wall protecting his right side, sandbags stacked waist-high on the interior, just enough room to sight his Car 9 8K through the gap. The first American round hit the exterior wall 6 inches left of his firing port. Brandt heard the impact, felt the vibration through the stone, barely registered it. Standard suppression fire. Nothing to worry about. The wall was half a meter thick at that point. He leaned into his rifle, trying to acquire the muzzle flash he'd spotted in the hedgerow. The second round hit 8 inches right of his port. Closer, but still not through the opening. Brandt was starting to understand this American's pattern, walking his shots toward the target, adjusting. Basic marksmanship. Brandt shifted his position slightly, getting ready to shoot the moment he had a clear sight picture. The third round hit the stone directly to the right of the firing port's edge. Brandt heard it impact, heard the sharp crack of spalling limestone. Small rock fragments peppered the interior wall behind him. His first twinge of unease came then, not fear, just a professional soldier's instinct that something wasn't quite normal about that impact pattern. The fourth round came through the wall, not through the firing port, through the actual wall, 15 inches from the port opening, through solid limestone that had stood since 1787. Brandt heard a sound he'd never heard before in 4 years of combat, a sharp, almost metallic shriek as the round drilled through stone. He felt the pressure wave as it passed 30 centimeters behind his head. He heard it crack into the opposite wall, punching into the interior limestone, felt fragments sting the back of his neck. For maybe 2 seconds, Brandt's brain refused to process what just happened. Rifle rounds didn't penetrate walls this thick. That was fundamental battlefield reality. Walls stopped bullets. That's why you took cover behind them. His training, his experience, 4 years of fighting, all of it said what just happened was impossible. The fifth round came through the wall 8 inches left of where the fourth round had penetrated. This time Brandt watched the interior surface of the limestone blow out, a cone of shattered rock fragments exploding inward. He threw himself backward, away from his fighting position, away from the firing port that was supposed to protect him. He landed on the floor beside Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich, who'd been manning the adjacent window. Dietrich was staring at him, face pale, and Brandt saw the same realization in the older man's eyes. The walls aren't stopping them. "They're shooting through the stone," Dietrich said. Not a question, a statement. He'd seen it too. Hauptmann Köhler was in the ground floor. Coordinating his company's fire through runners' radios were unreliable in the stone buildings. He heard the shooting intensify upstairs, heard the sharp crack of impacts that didn't sound quite right. Then Feldwebel Otto Kraus came down the stairs, half running, face showing the first edge of panic Köhler had ever seen from the man. "Herr Hauptmann, the Americans are penetrating the walls. Not through the ports, through the stone itself." Köhler stared at him. "The walls are half a meter thick, Kraus." "I know how thick they are, sir. I'm telling you what's happening." Steinmetz took a round through his position. Through the wall. He's dead. Georg Steinmetz had been one of Köhler's steadiest soldiers, a veteran of Stalingrad, not a man who made mistakes or took foolish risks. Köhler went upstairs, moving carefully, staying away from the exterior walls. The second floor was chaos. Men had abandoned their firing positions and pulled back to the interior walls, away from the windows. The steady hammer of American rifle fire continued outside, and now Köhler could hear it clearly, that sharp crack sound that wasn't quite the normal thump of rifle rounds hitting masonry. He moved to where Steinmetz lay, single entry wound, back of the head. No exit, the round had tumbled after penetrating the wall, dumping all its energy. Köhler examined the wall itself. Steinmetz's firing port was intact, sandbags undisturbed. 18 inches to the right was a small hole, maybe 8 millimeters wide, punched clean through the exterior limestone. Köhler put his finger against it, felt the sharp edges where the stone had been drilled out. He looked at the interior wall. Larger hole, maybe 15 centimeters across, surrounded by the spiderweb pattern of fractured limestone. The round had exited the wall with enough energy to kill a man and keep going into the opposite wall, where it finally stopped. Hauptmann Ernst Köhler was a rational man who believed in engineering and mathematics. A 7.92 mm Kar 98K round from his men's rifles had a muzzle energy of about 3,800 joules. The American 30-06 round, fired by the M1, Garand carried approximately 3,900 joules. Comparable, nearly identical. There was no physical reason the American round should penetrate significantly better than German ammunition, except it was penetrating, demonstrably, lethally. What Köhler didn't know, what no one in that farmhouse understood, was that the difference wasn't in the energy, it was in the bullet itself. The German 7.92x57 mm standard load used a round-nosed, copper-jacketed projectile, the SME design, which had been standard since 1905. Excellent accuracy, good range, proven battlefield performance. The round-nosed shape, however, was aerodynamically efficient but terrible at penetrating barriers. When it hit masonry, the round nose crushed and deformed, spreading impact energy across a wider area and fragmenting. The American 30-06 M2 ball cartridge used by the M1 Garand fired a 150-grain, spitzer-pointed, copper-jacketed, boat-tail projectile. The pointed spitzer design concentrated impact force onto a much smaller area. More importantly, the jacket and core were engineered differently. The copper jacket was thicker and bonded more tightly to the lead core. When it hit stone, wood, or brick, the M2 projectile held together longer, drilling through instead of fragmenting. The American Ordnance Department hadn't designed this round specifically for barrier penetration. They'd designed it for accuracy at range and consistent terminal ballistics. The penetration advantage was almost accidental, an engineering side effect of prioritizing other performance characteristics. But on the battlefields of Normandy, where every building was a potential strongpoint, that accidental advantage was rewriting the rules of infantry combat. Köhler pulled his men back from the exterior walls. The American fire continued, methodical, devastating. Every firing port was taking sustained, aimed shots. He could hear rounds punching through stonework all over the building now. The heavy thud of impacts, the sharp crack of spalling, occasionally the scream of a man hit by either the penetrating round or the fragments it threw up. The Americans hadn't even attempted to assault yet, they were just shooting, systematically destroying every defensive position with rifle fire from 80 meters away, firing from behind cover that German return fire couldn't penetrate. Unteroffizier Klaus Hoffmann was in the barn, positioned behind a stack of hay bales backed against the stone wall. He'd watched the farmhouse taking fire and initially thought his position was safer. The barn wall was thinner, maybe 30 centimeters, but he had the hay bales for additional protection, and the Americans seemed focused on the main building. Then he saw an American rifleman in the hedgerow 60 meters distant shift his aim toward the barn. Hoffmann ducked behind his hay bales as the first round hit. He heard it punch through the stone wall behind the hay. The round passed completely through the bales, and they were dense packed hay, old and compressed before drilling the interior wall. Hoffmann rolled to his left, trying to get to a different position. The next round came through exactly where he'd been, passing through wall, through hay bales, through the space where his chest had been 1 second earlier. He stopped thinking tactically at that point. He ran out the back of the barn, through the cattle door, across the rear courtyard to the next building. He wasn't the only one running. Men were abandoning positions all across the strongpoint, not from panic or cowardice, but from the rational calculation that their cover wasn't stopping the incoming fire. The fundamental contract of defensive warfare that thick walls protect you from rifles had been broken. Köhler watched his position disintegrate. His MG-42 teams couldn't maintain suppressing fire because they couldn't stay at their positions long enough to acquire and engage targets. His riflemen couldn't return effective fire because the moment they exposed themselves at a firing port, American riflemen put rounds through the walls beside the port, forcing them back. The Americans had figured out the technique: don't waste ammunition trying to shoot through the narrow firing port openings. Just shoot through the wall next to the port. Force the defender away from his weapon. At 0647 hours, 43 minutes after the American fire began, Köhler gave the order to withdraw. His company pulled back through the building's rear exits, using smoke from mortar fires to screen their movement. They left behind 7 dead, 11 wounded, too badly to move, and every carefully prepared defensive position they'd spent 16 days fortifying. The Americans occupied the hamlet without firing another shot. They walked through positions that should have held a rifle company for days and found them abandoned, walls pockmarked with penetrations, interior spaces littered with limestone fragments and ejected M1 Garand clips. Lieutenant Robert Hendricks, commanding the American platoon, examined the farmhouse afterward. He was a former high school history teacher from Ohio, commissioned in 1943, in France for 6 weeks. He ran his hand over the penetration holes in the stone walls, counted 16 separate impacts just in the ground floor. He'd known the M1 Garand was a good rifle, every soldier knew that, but he hadn't realized it could do this. None of them had. They'd just started shooting at targets they could see through firing ports, and when that didn't work, they'd adjusted, started shooting at the walls beside the ports. Basic fire and maneuver, nothing special. But something special had happened here. Something that would ripple through Wehrmacht defensive doctrine for the rest of the war. That same day, 6 kilometers north, another German company abandoned another stone farmhouse under identical circumstances. American riflemen putting sustained fire through walls, forcing defenders away from positions that were supposed to be proof against small arms. 20 kilometers west, a Wehrmacht battalion commander filed a report noting abnormal penetration characteristics of American rifle ammunition and requesting immediate guidance on defensive position construction. The reports filtered up through division, corps, army group levels, each level adding its own observations, its own casualty counts, its own increasingly desperate requests for information about how to defend against this. Because that was the truly devastating thing, nobody in the German command structure wanted to believe it at first. Stone walls had stopped rifle fire for 500 years. That was historical fact. The idea that American infantry rifles could negate the protective value of European masonry construction seemed absurd, but the casualties were real, the abandoned positions were real, and within 2 weeks, every German infantry division in Normandy was dealing with the same phenomenon. The defensive doctrine that had anchored German tactical thinking since 1939. Use buildings and walls as strongpoints, create interlocking fields of fire, and force the enemy to assault prepared positions that doctrine assumed your cover actually covered you. When it didn't, everything else fell apart. Hauptmann Köhler's 3rd Company never recovered its combat effectiveness. They fell back to secondary positions, then tertiary positions, always 1 step ahead of American infantry that no longer showed any hesitation about closing with German strongpoints. The Americans had learned something too, that their rifles could suppress defenders in buildings without having to call for artillery or tank support. That changed the tempo of infantry combat, made American advances faster, more aggressive. Köhler himself survived until August 19th, when his position near Falaise was overrun. He died holding a stone wall that hadn't protected him. The irony wouldn't have been lost on him. But back in July, in that moment when he stood in the farmhouse looking at Georg Steinmetz's body and the neat hole punched through 18 inches of Normandy limestone, Köhler understood with absolute clarity that something fundamental had shifted. The Americans weren't just out fighting German infantry with superior numbers or firepower. They were doing it with a technological advantage so subtle that most soldiers on both sides didn't even understand what they were seeing. A bullet, a slightly different design, pointed instead of round-nosed, better jacket construction, nothing revolutionary, nothing that would make headlines or change weapon specifications on paper. But in the hedgerows of France, where every wall was a battlefield and every building a potential tomb, that slight difference was rewriting the rules of infantry warfare, 1 penetration hole at a time. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The penetration problem reached Wehrmacht High Command through channels that should have triggered immediate response, but didn't. By July 20th, 1944, 8 days after Köhler's company abandoned that nameless hamlet defensive position, reports from Normandy were stacking up on desks at OB West headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Generaloberst Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff, read through 17 separate incident reports describing the same phenomenon. American rifle fire defeating stone and brick cover that German doctrine classified as hard protection. The reports came from different divisions, different sectors, different types of engagements, but the pattern was consistent. German infantry establishing defensive positions in Norman buildings would come under American rifle fire. Within minutes, rounds would begin penetrating walls the defenders had assumed were impenetrable. Casualties would mount, positions would be abandoned. American infantry would advance without calling in artillery support or requesting armor. What made these reports particularly troubling wasn't just the tactical problem they described. It was the psychological dimension bleeding through the formal military language. Experienced Unteroffiziers were using words like demoralized and shaken confidence when describing their men's reactions to wall penetrations. Company commanders reported difficulty getting soldiers to occupy stone buildings, even when those buildings offered the only available cover. The fundamental trust between soldier and fortification, the bedrock assumption that thick walls equal safety, was eroding. Blumentritt convened a technical assessment committee on July 22. The group included ordnance specialists, combat engineers, and a ballistics expert from the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Agency. Their task was straightforward: determine whether American .30-06 ammunition actually possessed superior penetration characteristics, and if so, why German intelligence had failed to identify this before the invasion. The committee worked around the clock, requisitioning samples of captured American ammunition from forward depots. They conducted hasty testing at a Wehrmacht proving ground near Paris, firing both German 7.92 x57 mm and American .30-06 rounds into sections of Norman limestone that engineers had transported from demolished buildings. The results were unambiguous and deeply troubling. Against 40-centimeter limestone walls, the standard thickness in Norman farmhouse construction, the German S.M.E. ammunition achieved full penetration in approximately 28% of shots. The American M2 ball ammunition penetrated 78% of the time. Against brick construction, the differential was similar, 35% German penetration versus 81% American. Even against oak timber, common in barn doors and interior partitions, the American ammunition showed superior performance. The committee's findings, delivered 48 hours after convening, were simultaneously enlightening and damning. Yes, the American M2 ball, 30-06 cartridge, demonstrated measurably superior penetration against masonry, brick, and wood barriers compared to standard German 7.92 x57 mm ammunition. The difference stemmed from projectile design, specifically the pointed spitzer shape and improved jacket construction of the American round versus the round-nosed profile of German standard ammunition. But the truly damning discovery came when the ballistics expert, Hauptmann Dr. Werner Schulz, presented his historical analysis. He'd spent 6 hours in the Heereswaffenamt archives pulling ammunition development files from the previous 4 decades. What he found was a pattern of institutional blindness that had cost German infantry dearly. Schulz explained that German ordnance specialists had known about Spitzer projectile designs since 1898, when France introduced the Barley-D ammunition. Germany itself had experimented extensively with pointed projectiles between 1903 and 1905, ultimately adopting the Spitzer design for the 7.92 x57 mm cartridge. Early German Spitzer ammunition, designated S-Patron, had demonstrated excellent penetration characteristics in testing, but in 1905, responding to concerns about excessive ricochet danger and reports of through-and-through wounds that failed to incapacitate enemy soldiers quickly, the Heereswaffenamt had modified the design. The SME variant adopted that year used a slightly more rounded profile and softer core construction that enhanced terminal ballistics against human targets but reduced barrier penetration. This was considered an acceptable trade-off in an era when most infantry combat still occurred in open terrain. The decision had been revisited in 1918, when trench warfare had demonstrated the importance of penetrating wood, sandbags, and earthworks. A technical committee had recommended developing improved penetration ammunition, but the armistice arrived before any modifications could be implemented. In the interwar years, with Germany restricted to a small army by Versailles Treaty limitations, ammunition development had focused on cost reduction and manufacturing efficiency rather than performance optimization. When German rearmament began in the mid-1930s, the Wehrmacht had simply scaled up production of existing S.M.E. ammunition. No one had questioned whether a cartridge designed in 1905 for open-field warfare remained optimal for the urban and semi-urban combat environments of modern mechanized warfare. The institutional memory of the 1,918 penetration studies had been lost in the chaos of demobilization and the personnel discontinuities of the Versailles period. So Germany had entered World War II with ammunition that was, by 1944 standards, optimized for the wrong tactical environment. The Americans, developing their 30-06 M2 ball cartridge in the late 1930s with no institutional baggage from World War I, had prioritized long-range accuracy and consistency. The superior penetration was almost accidental, a side effect of using modern manufacturing techniques and projectile designs that happened to be ideal for the building-to-building warfare that would characterize European combat. Schulz's presentation left the committee in uncomfortable silence. The penetration problem wasn't a failure of German engineering or metallurgy. It was a failure of doctrine and institutional learning. The Wehrmacht had gone to war with ammunition designed for yesterday's battlefield. The committee's report included a recommendation that should have been obvious: immediately develop and field test improved barrier penetration ammunition for German infantry rifles. Schulz estimated development timeline at 6 to 8 weeks. They could essentially resurrect the 1,918 penetration studies and apply modern manufacturing techniques. Field deployment would take 4 to 6 months, assuming no production delays and assuming ammunition plants weren't bombed or disrupted by the deteriorating strategic situation. The report sat on Blumentrit's desk for 3 days. He read it twice, understood its implications, and also understood that it was meaningless. By late July 1944, Germany was fighting for survival on 3 fronts. The Eastern Front was collapsing in Belarus under the Soviet summer offensive. Italy was a bleeding wound. Normandy was becoming a catastrophe. Resources that might have gone to ammunition development were being diverted to jet fighters, V-weapons, and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain production of basic war materiel. Blumentritt forwarded the report to higher headquarters with a notation that battlefield conditions in Normandy made any medium-term ammunition redesign program strategically irrelevant. By the time new ammunition could reach frontline units, those units would either be destroyed or pushed back into Germany. The Normandy campaign would be decided long before improved ammunition arrived. Better to focus on immediate tactical adaptations than on engineering solutions that couldn't be implemented in time. So the tactical guidance sent to field commanders on July 28 ignored ammunition entirely and focused on revised defensive doctrine. The new orders, distributed as a supplement to existing infantry regulations, instructed units to treat all stone and brick walls as limited protection only against American rifle fire. The guidance included specific recommendations: increase effective wall thickness by adding interior earthwork reinforcement, avoid static defensive positions that relied on single wall barriers, maintain greater depth in defensive layouts to allow rapid position changes when primary walls failed to provide adequate protection, and prioritize positions in buildings with double wall construction or stone walls exceeding 60 centimeters thickness. These recommendations were theoretically sound. Engineers had calculated that adding 30 centimeters of packed earth behind a stone wall would reduce American penetration probability to less than 15%. Maintaining defensive depth would allow defenders to abandon compromised positions without losing control of the overall sector. Double wall construction, common in larger buildings and churches, provided overlapping barriers that even M2 ball ammunition struggled to defeat. But theory and practice diverged dramatically in the Normandy bocage. German infantry were fighting from whatever cover they could find, usually buildings and hedgerows that had been there for centuries. They didn't have time to excavate and move tons of earth for interior reinforcement. They didn't have the engineering equipment or labor. They were constantly under artillery fire, under air attack, under pressure from American infantry that was becoming more aggressive as the campaign progressed. The units that actually attempted to implement the new guidance found it consumed enormous resources for marginal benefit. A pioneer platoon attached to the 352nd Infantry Division spent 4 days reinforcing a company strongpoint with interior earthworks according to the new doctrine. American artillery destroyed the position in a 20-minute preparation barrage before American infantry ever engaged it. The earthworks that were supposed to stop rifle bullets provided zero protection against 105mm howitzer shells. The defensive doctrine amendments arrived at frontline units as mimeographed sheets distributed through company commanders. Production quality was poor smudged text, barely legible diagrams showing cross-sections of reinforced walls. Most soldiers never saw them. Units in active combat had more immediate concerns than reading doctrinal updates. Those who did read the guidance found it absurdly disconnected from battlefield reality. Obergefreiter Franz Weber, 276th Infantry Division, serving in a rifle company south of St. Lo, received the doctrine update on August 1st. His company had just been pulled off the line after losing 16 men in 3 days. Weber read through the mimeographed sheets in a barn that served as temporary company headquarters, then passed them to his squad leader, Feldwebel Anton Richter. Richter read in silence, then looked at Weber with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and contempt. They tell us stone walls won't stop American bullets, as if we hadn't already learned that lesson with our blood. They tell us to build thicker walls, as if we have concrete and time and aren't being shelled every hour. They tell us nothing useful. Weber later wrote about this moment in a letter that reached his family through Red Cross channels after he was captured in August. The letter, preserved in family archives, captures the disconnect between high command thinking and frontline reality. The officers in their headquarters, safe behind the Seine, send us papers explaining what we already know, that we are dying because our cover is not enough. But they send no engineers, no materials, no time to build what they tell us we need. They send only papers and orders to hold positions that cannot be held. This sentiment that higher command was issuing guidance disconnected from operational reality pervaded German infantry units throughout August. The revised defensive doctrine hadn't solved the penetration problem. It had simply acknowledged it officially, which somehow made it worse. Soldiers who'd been hoping that technical experts would identify a solution instead learned that there was no solution, only recommendations that couldn't be implemented. Meanwhile, American infantry were learning their own lessons, and unlike the German command structure, they were learning them bottom-up, from riflemen who experimented and shared techniques. The initial wall penetrations in early July had been almost accidental soldiers shooting at firing ports, bullets hitting adjacent stonework, unexpected penetrations. But by late July, American rifle companies were deliberately employing barrier penetration tactics. The technique spread through informal networks that bypassed official channels entirely. Soldiers talked to each other during brief rest periods behind the lines, sharing observations about what worked. "We were shooting at this farmhouse," a private from the 29th Infantry Division told soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division during a rest period, "and we figured out if you just aim about 6 inches to the side of the windows, your rounds go through the wall, and the Krauts can't stay at their guns." This kind of tactical knowledge transfer happened constantly. Officers shared observations at battalion briefings. The 3rd platoon found that if you get 2 or 3 men with Garands all shooting at the same section of wall, you can basically Swiss cheese it, a lieutenant would report. They got a whole squad of Germans to abandon a position without even using the BAR. Non-coms discussed it over coffee and cigarettes. "Forget trying to shoot through the actual firing ports," a sergeant would tell his squad leaders. "That's a waste of ammunition. Just shoot at the walls around the ports, you'll get penetrations, and even if you don't kill anybody, You'll scare them away from their positions. A rifle squad in the 29th Infantry Division developed a method they called stitching, systematically firing into walls in a grid pattern around known or suspected German positions. The technique used the M1 Garand's 8-round capacity efficiently. A rifleman would fire his entire clip in a horizontal line across a wall section, reload, then fire another clip in a parallel line slightly higher or lower. Multiple riflemen stitching the same wall section would create overlapping penetration zones that made it nearly impossible for defenders to find safe positions near that wall. Another squad in the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, discovered that firing at steep angles into walls shooting slightly downward from elevated positions created unpredictable fragment patterns inside buildings. The spalling effect when rounds penetrated stone at oblique angles threw rock fragments in directions the defenders couldn't predict or shield against. These fragments were often more dangerous than the penetrating rounds themselves, creating wounds from directions that seemed impossible. A platoon from the 9th Infantry Division developed what they called the piano technique. Riflemen spread out at different distances from a target building, from 50 to 100 meters, all firing at the same wall sections but from different angles. The varied trajectories meant penetrating rounds entered the building's interior at different angles, covering more internal space and making it harder for defenders to identify safe zones. These weren't official tactics. They didn't appear in training manuals or after-action reports filed with division headquarters. They were field expedients developed by combat soldiers who realized their rifles could do something the pre-invasion training at Fort Benning had never mentioned. The M1 Garand's semi-automatic capability meant each rifleman could fire 8 aimed shots in rapid succession, walking rounds across a wall face, probing for weak points, creating multiple penetration paths, all without the delay of manually cycling a bolt-action rifle. This bottom-up tactical evolution represented a form of organizational learning that German forces, increasingly rigid and hierarchical as the war situation deteriorated, couldn't match. American infantry units were adapting faster than German defensive doctrine could respond because the Americans were adapting at the squad level, where observation and implementation collapsed into the same decision cycle. By the time German Higher Command identified a tactical problem, drafted guidance, and disseminated it to frontline units, American soldiers had already moved on to the next adaptation. German soldiers experienced this evolution as an inexorable tightening of pressure. Positions that might have held for hours in early July were being neutralized in minutes by late July. Buildings that seemed like natural strongpoints became death traps when American riflemen suppressed them from multiple angles simultaneously, putting sustained fire through walls from directions the defensive plans hadn't accounted for. The psychological impact was cumulative and devastating. Each wall penetration, each casualty from a round that came through what should have been solid protection, each abandoned position, added to a growing conviction among German infantry that they were fighting at a fundamental disadvantage that had nothing to do with courage or skill, and everything to do with equipment. They couldn't change, and tactics couldn't counter. Lieutenant Friedrich Hartmann, commanding a platoon in the 353rd Infantry Division, watched this dynamic destroy his unit over a 2-week period in early August. His platoon occupied a series of stone houses along a secondary road 3 kilometers west of Vire. The positions were good by any reasonable standard intersecting fields of fire, natural choke points created by hedgerows and sunken roads, pre-registered mortar concentrations covering likely American approach routes. His men were veterans, most of them survivors from the Eastern Front, soldiers who'd held positions against Soviet infantry assaults at Kursk, men who understood defensive warfare and weren't easily rattled. On August 3rd, an American patrol probed his forward positions. Standard reconnaissance, nothing aggressive, 2 scout teams, maybe 8 men total, moving carefully through the hedgerows. Hartmann's men engaged at 150 meters, drove them back with rifle and machine gun fire. No American casualties observed. The patrol withdrew after a brief firefight. Textbook defensive success. The kind of engagement that validated everything Hartmann had learned about holding prepared positions. The next morning, 4 American riflemen occupied hedgerow positions 70 to 90 meters from Hartmann's main strongpoint. They didn't attack, they didn't maneuver, they just started shooting. Methodical, aimed fire into the stone walls of Hartmann's buildings. The distinctive 8-round ping-ping-ping-ping-ping-ping-ping rhythm of M1 Garands echoed across the morning fields, overlapping as the riflemen staggered their reloads. Within 20 minutes, 2 of his soldiers were wounded by penetrating rounds. Gefreiter Paul Schmidt took a round through his shoulder. The bullet had punched through 45 centimeters of stone wall, passed through Schmidt's position, and embedded itself in the opposite wall. Gefreiter Ludwig Brenner was hit by rock fragments when a round penetrated next to his firing port, the spalling limestone catching him across the face and neck. Neither wound was life-threatening, but both men had to be evacuated, and the manner of their wounding through walls they'd trusted affected the rest of the platoon visibly. Within an hour, Hartmann's forward position was untenable, not because it was destroyed or under overwhelming fire, but because his men refused to stay near the exterior walls. They'd pulled back to interior rooms, huddled against internal partitions, away from the systematic American fire. The defensive position that Hartmann had carefully organized, with overlapping fields of fire and designated shooting positions, had collapsed. His soldiers were still alive, still armed, still theoretically capable of defending, but they couldn't defend effectively from interior rooms with no firing ports. Hartmann pulled them back to his secondary position, 200 meters to the rear, another set of stone buildings that he'd prepared as a fallback line. The withdrawal was conducted properly, under covering fire from his machine gun teams. No casualties during the movement. Tactically, it was executed well, but it was also a defeat. 4 American riflemen had forced an entire German platoon to abandon a strongpoint without attempting an assault, without taking casualties, without even exposing themselves to effective return fire. Hartmann understood intellectually what had happened. The American ammunition penetrated walls better than German ammunition, creating a standoff engagement where German defensive advantages were negated. But understanding it didn't help him solve it. By afternoon, the American riflemen had advanced, occupied the abandoned buildings, and were shooting at Hartmann's new positions. Same technique, same methodical wall penetration, same psychological effect on his soldiers. The defensive depth he'd built into his position, which was supposed to allow him to trade space for time, was evaporating without inflicting meaningful casualties on the Americans. By evening, Hartmann had lost 5 men, 2 killed, 3 wounded without ever seeing more than 4 American soldiers. His platoon, which had numbered 38 men that morning, was down to 33 effectives, and those remaining were showing signs of what Hartmann could only describe as moral disintegration. These weren't cowards or inexperienced troops. They were veterans who'd survived campaigns that had destroyed entire divisions. But something about this engagement, the invisible enemy, the walls that didn't protect, the casualties from directions that should have been safe, had broken something fundamental in them. The psychological impact devastated his platoon more than the casualties did. These were men who'd survived Kursk, who'd held positions against Soviet infantry assaults that came in waves of hundreds, who understood defensive warfare and the mathematics of firepower versus cover. But this was different. The Russians had attacked in masses that you could see and shoot. The enemy was visible, tangible, something you could fight against. If you held your position and maintained fire discipline, you could break Russian attacks, watch them falter, and withdraw. Know that your defensive position had worked as intended. The Americans were killing from positions where German return fire was ineffective, using rifles to do what machine guns and artillery should be necessary for. There was no visible mass of attackers to break, no assault wave to repel, just a few riflemen in hedgerows systematically dismantling defensive positions through a capability German doctrine didn't account for. The psychological equation of defensive warfare that prepared positions give the defender overwhelming advantages had been inverted, and Hartmann's men couldn't process it. On August 5th, Hartmann's platoon withdrew without orders, abandoning positions that were still technically defensible from a tactical perspective. The buildings were intact, his weapons were functional, his ammunition supply was adequate, but his men were done. They walked away from their positions in small groups, heading toward the rear, toward anywhere that wasn't under that precise, wall-penetrating American fire. Hauptmann made no effort to stop them. He walked with them, his pistol holstered, his map case still over his shoulder, still technically in command of a unit that had ceased to exist as a fighting force. He reported to his company commander, Hauptmann Victor Schroeder, that his platoon was combat ineffective due to morale collapse. Schroeder was an old-school officer, a veteran of Poland and France, a man who believed in discipline and the soldier's duty to hold his position regardless of circumstances. He dressed Hauptmann down for defeatism, accused him of abandoning positions prematurely, questioned his leadership and his courage. The dressing down lasted 15 minutes, conducted in front of other officers, humiliating and deliberate. Then Schroeder ordered Hauptmann back to the line with what remained of his platoon. You will return to your defensive sector. You will reoccupy your positions. You will hold until ordered to withdraw or until the position is overrun. Those are your orders. Hauptmann returned to his positions. He had no choice. Disobeying a direct order meant court-martial, possibly execution. He led his remaining 33 men back to the stone buildings they'd abandoned, reoccupied the firing positions, redistributed ammunition, tried to rebuild the defensive organization that had disintegrated. For 2 days, his position remained quiet. No American probes, no rifle fire. Hauptmann allowed himself to hope that maybe his platoon could recover, that maybe the Americans had moved on to other sectors. But on August 7th, the rifle fire resumed. Different American soldiers, probably, but the same technique. Methodical shooting into the walls, rounds penetrating, spalling, creating casualties from impossible angles. 3 more of his men were killed over the next 6 hours. Wilhelm Vogel, who'd survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, died from a round that penetrated through a wall he'd been standing beside. Franz Müller was killed by rock fragments when multiple American rounds penetrated the same section of wall simultaneously, creating a catastrophic spalling effect that threw limestone shrapnel throughout the interior room. Heinrich Bauer died covering the withdrawal of his wounded squadmate shot through a wall he'd been using as cover. On August 8th, what remained of Hauptmann's platoon disintegrated, not in a single moment, not in panic, but in a gradual dissolution as individual soldiers simply stopped fighting. Men abandoned their weapons and walked toward the rear. Others stayed in place but refused to return fire, huddled in corners away from exterior walls. A few continued fighting, but without unit cohesion, without coordinated fire, their resistance was ineffective. Hauptmann didn't stop them. He watched his platoon dissolve and felt nothing but exhaustion and the bitter understanding that Hauptmann Schroeder's orders to hold the position had been based on a doctrine that no longer applied. You couldn't order men to trust cover that didn't protect them. You couldn't maintain defensive positions when the fundamental contract between soldier and fortification had been broken. He walked away from his position that evening, following the same roads his men had taken toward the rear. By August 10th, what remained of his platoon had been absorbed into other units, or had simply vanished into the chaos of the collapsing German position in Normandy. Hauptmann himself was captured by American forces on August 17th, found walking alone on a road south of Argenton, no longer attached to any unit, no longer part of any command structure. This pattern, individual units maintaining positional defense being systematically destroyed, not through overwhelming American numbers or firepower, but through grinding psychological attrition, replicated across the Normandy front throughout August. German infantry units that should have been able to hold their positions were abandoning them or being rendered combat ineffective through a process that German doctrine had no answer for. The after-action reports from German commanders throughout this period show a consistent pattern of incomprehension mixed with desperation. Company and battalion commanders reported defensive failures but struggled to explain them in tactical terms. Positions abandoned despite adequate cover and ammunition was a common phrase. Troops refusing to occupy prepared defensive works appeared repeatedly. Morale collapse under American rifle fire became almost formulaic. Higher commanders, reading these reports at division and corps level, often interpreted them as failures of leadership or discipline. Courts-martial increased through August as senior officers tried to restore defensive effectiveness through enforcement of traditional military discipline. Several company commanders were relieved for defeatism. At least 3 platoon leaders were court-martialed for abandoning positions without orders, though the deteriorating situation meant most these courts-martial never reached conclusion. But the problem wasn't discipline or leadership. It was a mismatch between doctrine and reality that German forces couldn't resolve tactically. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine had been predicated on making the attacker pay such a high price for every advance that the attack would bog down, creating opportunities for counterattacks that would restore the line. German infantry were trained to hold prepared positions, to inflict casualties through careful fire discipline and interlocking fields of fire, to trade American lives for German ground at ratios that would make Allied advance unsustainable. But American infantry weren't paying those prices anymore. They were using their M1 Garands to neutralize German positions at ranges, and with methods that German defensive planning hadn't accounted for. The expected casualties weren't materializing because American infantry could suppress German strongpoints without closing to assault distance, without exposing themselves to the kind of close-range defensive fire that German doctrine expected would break attacks. The mathematics of attrition warfare had shifted. In early July, a German company holding a village or hamlet could expect to inflict 5 to 10 American casualties per building before being forced to withdraw. By late July, that ratio had dropped to 1 or 2 casualties per building. By August, American infantry were occupying German strongpoints without taking significant casualties at all. They'd simply shoot through the walls until the defenders abandoned the position. At Mortain, during the German counteroffensive launched on August 7th, this dynamic played out in reverse, and the results were catastrophic for German forces. The counteroffensive was Hitler's personal gambit, an attempt to split the American armies and drive toward Avranches, cutting off Patton's forces that had broken out into Brittany. The attack used elite SS Panzer divisions, supported by regular Wehrmacht infantry. German infantry attacking American defensive positions found themselves receiving the same treatment German defenders had been experiencing all summer. American soldiers in stone houses and buildings around Mortain used their Garands to fire through walls at advancing German infantry, creating casualties among attackers who thought they were using proper tactical spacing and cover. Oberst Rudolf von Gersdorf, commanding elements of the counterattack's infantry component, watched his assault companies take casualties from American positions that his men couldn't suppress effectively with return fire. His after-action report, filed on August 10th after the counteroffensive had clearly failed, included observations that read like a mirror image of American experiences earlier in the summer. American defensive fire was abnormally effective against infantry in normal tactical formation, von Gersdorf wrote. Our attacking companies suffered casualties approaching 30% in the initial assault phase before reaching close combat ranges, and from American rifle fire that appeared to penetrate cover our tactical manuals classify as adequate. Attempts to suppress American positions through supporting fire from our own infantry weapons proved ineffective. American riflemen maintained defensive fires even under direct fire from our assault guns and supporting artillery. Von Gersdorf's report noted that German casualties from small arms fire were running 3 times higher than expected based on pre-war doctrine assumptions about defensive rifle effectiveness. He didn't explicitly connect this to ammunition penetration characteristics either. He hadn't been briefed on the technical assessments from late July, or he didn't make the connection, but the implication was clear in his tactical observations. The Mortain counteroffensive collapsed within days. German forces lost over 100 tanks and self-propelled guns, thousands of infantry, and whatever remaining offensive capability they'd possessed in Normandy. With it went the last German hope of containing the Allied breakout. By mid-August, the remnants of German forces in Normandy were trapped in the Falaise pocket, where they were systematically destroyed by Allied air power and artillery. As German forces retreated toward the Seine and then back toward the German border, the wall penetration problem became almost irrelevant operationally, not because it was solved, but because German infantry were no longer holding static defensive positions. They were conducting fighting withdrawals through open country, moving at night, avoiding contact whenever possible. Buildings and stone walls were occasional features in the landscape, not the primary terrain that defined tactical engagements. But the psychological damage remained, and it would persist through the rest of the war. German infantry who'd survived Normandy carried with them into the fighting in Belgium, Holland, and eventually Germany itself a fundamental mistrust of stone structures as protection against American rifle fire. This wasn't superstition or irrationality, it was learned behavior based on painful experience. After-action reports from September and October 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward the German border, repeatedly noted that German soldiers preferred to dig field fortifications rather than occupy existing buildings, even when those buildings would have provided better protection against artillery and weather. Divisional commanders observed this behavior and sometimes interpreted it as another manifestation of the morale problems that had plagued German forces since Normandy. But frontline soldiers understood it differently. "We dug foxholes even when there were perfectly good buildings nearby," wrote Unteroffizier Martin Fischer in his memoir published in 1953. "The officers thought we were being foolish, wasting energy on digging when we could have just occupied the buildings. But we'd learned in France that American rifles went through walls. In a foxhole, at least you knew the earth would stop the bullets. In a building, you had no idea if the walls would protect you or not. Better to trust the earth than trust walls that had already killed too many of our comrades." This preference for field fortifications over buildings had tactical consequences throughout the fall campaign. German defensive positions were easier for Allied artillery and air power to suppress when defenders were in open foxholes rather than buildings. German infantry took higher casualties from indirect fire and air attack, but they persisted in avoiding buildings when possible because the perceived risk from American rifles outweighed the actual increased vulnerability to artillery. This wasn't entirely irrational. The M1 Garand's penetration advantage remained consistent across different theatres and different types of construction. In Aachen, during the bitter urban fighting in October 1944, American riflemen used the same wall penetration techniques they'd developed in Normandy. The city's buildings were generally more substantial than Norman farmhouses, thicker walls, reinforced construction, purpose-built apartment blocks, and commercial structures. But the M1 Garands, 30-06 ammunition, proved capable of penetrating these urban walls as well. The house-to-house fighting in Aachen saw American infantry systematically suppressing German positions by shooting through walls, floors, and ceilings. The three-dimensional nature of urban combat meant that penetration worked vertically, as well as horizontally. American soldiers learned to shoot through floors at German defenders below them, or through ceilings at defenders above. The M2 ball ammunition would reliably penetrate wooden floor joists, plaster, and the stone or concrete between floors in most of Aachen's buildings. In the Hürtgen forest, where fighting often took place around isolated bunkers and pillboxes constructed by the Germans as part of the Siegfried Line fortifications, Americans learned that sustained M1 fire could penetrate the wooden shutters and door frames of German fortifications, even when it couldn't penetrate the concrete walls. This forced German defenders to either keep their firing ports shuttered, making them blind, or leave them open, and risk American riflemen putting sustained fire through the openings, which often resulted in rounds ricocheting inside the bunker or hitting defenders positioned near the ports. The cumulative effect across all these engagements was that German defensive doctrine, which had worked reasonably well in earlier campaigns, was increasingly ineffective against American infantry armed with M1 Garands. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound and lasting, creating a form of learned helplessness where defensive positions that should have provided security instead felt like traps. German ordnance specialists, operating now from facilities in the Reich itself, finally produced an improved Spitzer profile ammunition for the Kar-9 in October 1944. The development had been rushed just 3 months from authorization to initial production, and the ammunition reflected that haste. The 7. 92 X57 MMS S. Patrone-schweres Spitzgeschoss, or heavy pointed bullet, incorporated design features intended to improve barrier penetration. The new round used a pointed projectile similar to the American Spitzer design, with a strengthened copper jacket and optimized core bonding that kept the bullet together longer when hitting barriers. Testing at the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds in September showed it performed comparably to American 30-06 M2 ball against masonry and brick targets. Against 40 cm limestone, the SS Patrone achieved 73% penetration versus 78% for the M2 ball, close enough that the practical difference would be negligible in combat. Production began at ammunition plants in Nuremberg and Magdeburg in November 1944. Initial delivery to frontline units occurred in December, with priority going to Western Front divisions facing American forces. Total quantity delivered before production facilities were overrun by Allied forces or destroyed by bombing in early 1945, approximately 18 million rounds. For context, the German military was firing roughly 50 to 70 million rifle rounds per month in late 1944 when ammunition was available, which it increasingly wasn't. The improved S. Patrone ammunition represented less than 3 weeks of average consumption, delivered over a 3-month period, to an army that was already disintegrating under pressure from both east and west. Most soldiers never encountered it. Distribution was chaotic in the winter of 1944 to 1945, with ammunition supplies often failing to reach frontline units due to transportation disruptions, bombing of rail networks, and the general breakdown of German logistics. Those soldiers who did receive the new ammunition found it made negligible difference in tactical outcomes, not because it didn't work as advertised, but because by early 1945, ammunition characteristics were irrelevant to Germany's strategic situation. A German rifle company receiving improved barrier penetration ammunition in January 1945 was still outnumbered, outgunned, undersupplied, facing enemies with total air superiority and overwhelming material advantages. Better bullets didn't change those fundamental realities. The penetration advantage that might have mattered in July 1944, when the Normandy campaign could still have taken different trajectories, was meaningless in January 1945, when Germany was simply fighting to delay inevitable defeat. The United States military, meanwhile, conducted extensive studies in 1945 and 1946, analyzing the effectiveness of the M1 Garand in European combat. Army Ground Forces published a comprehensive assessment in March 1946 titled Combat Effectiveness of Infantry Small Arms, European Theatre 1944 to 1945. The report ran to 247 pages and covered every aspect of infantry weapons, performance, reliability, maintainability, accuracy, rate of fire, logistics, and soldier preference. The barrier penetration characteristics received surprisingly little attention in the official report. Army analysts focused primarily on rate of fire, reliability, and the psychological advantages of semi-automatic operation. The ability of the M1 to fire 8 rounds as fast as the soldier could pull the trigger was identified as the weapon's single most significant advantage over German bolt-action rifles. The report noted that American infantry could generate 3 to 4 times the volume of fire of German infantry in typical tactical engagements, and this fire superiority had consistently provided tactical advantages in combat. Penetration was mentioned briefly in a technical appendix covering ballistic performance against intermediate barriers. The report noted that M2 ball 30-06 ammunition demonstrated satisfactory penetration of common battlefield cover materials including wood, masonry, and light earthworks. But there was no detailed analysis of how this affected tactical outcomes, no discussion of the psychological impact on enemy forces, no recognition that this might have been a decisive advantage in the close-terrain fighting of Normandy and the urban combat in German cities. This was partly because American soldiers themselves didn't fully understand what they'd been doing. Most riflemen who'd successfully suppressed German positions by shooting through walls thought they'd just gotten lucky, hit weak spots in the masonry, or caught German soldiers in the open. The systematic nature of the M2 ball's penetration advantage wasn't obvious to the men pulling the triggers. It felt like good marksmanship and aggressive tactics, not like exploiting a technical advantage. It was only in post-war analysis, when researchers compared German and American ammunition against standardized barrier materials under controlled conditions, that the full extent of the penetration differential became clear. The research was conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland in 1947, part of a comprehensive study of small arms ammunition performance. Engineers constructed test barriers using materials sourced from Europe, actual Norman limestone, German brick, European oak timber, trying to replicate the conditions soldiers had encountered in combat. The testing was methodical and extensive. Each ammunition type was fired at different barriers from different ranges, with multiple trials to establish statistical significance. The results were documented in technical reports that exist today in Army archives, dry compilations of ballistic data that tell a story the soldiers never fully understood. The M2 ball, 30-06 round, fired by the M1 Garand, would reliably penetrate barriers that stopped German 7, 9, 2X, 5, 7, M, S, M, E. Ammunition 60 to 70% of the time in standardized testing. Against typical Norman limestone construction, specifically 40-centimeter walls using Caen limestone or similar materials, the difference was even more pronounced, 78% American penetration versus 28% German penetration. Against German brick construction common in urban areas, M2 ball achieved 81% penetration versus 35% for S, M, E. These numbers, compiled in sterile testing facilities years after the war, represented thousands of German soldiers who'd crouched behind walls that didn't protect them. They represented tactical decisions made on the assumption that stone meant safety, defensive doctrines written before anyone realized a slightly different bullet design could make centuries-old fortifications obsolete against rifle fire. They represented the gap between what German military doctrine promised and what German soldiers experienced, a gap measured in penetration percentages and filled with casualties. The Aberdeen studies also revealed something interesting about the improved German S Patron ammunition, developed in 1944. When tested against the same barriers, it performed almost identically to the American M2 ball 73% penetration versus 78% against limestone, 79% versus 81% against brick. The Germans had solved the technical problem. They'd designed ammunition that matched American performance, but they'd solved it too late, produced it in insufficient quantities, and distributed it into a military situation where technical advantages no longer mattered. In 1952, NATO standardization trials evaluated various rifle cartridges for adoption as the alliance's standard infantry round. The trials were conducted at multiple proving grounds across Europe and North America, with representatives from all NATO militaries participating. The goal was to select a single standard cartridge that would be used by all member nations, simplifying logistics and ammunition supply in any future conflict. The 7, 6, 2, X5, 1, mm NATO cartridge that emerged from these trials incorporated specific design requirements derived from World War II experience. The technical specifications explicitly included barrier penetration as a key performance metric. The M80 ball round adopted as NATO standard used a pointed, boat-tail projectile with bonded core construction, specifically optimized for penetrating light barriers and intermediate cover. The NATO trials tested candidate ammunition against standardized barrier materials, including 40-centimeter limestone, the Normandy farmhouse standard, 30-centimeter brick wall, 20-centimeter reinforced concrete, 10-centimeter oak planking, and various intermediate barriers like sandbags, earthworks, and light vehicle bodies. To be acceptable, ammunition had to achieve minimum penetration percentages against each barrier type. Those percentages were derived directly from analysis of M1 Garand performance in World War II. Essentially, the American M2 ball's accidental penetration advantages became the NATO standard by which all future infantry ammunition would be judged. The wall that failed to protect Wilhelm Brandt in July 1944 became the baseline test standard for an entire military alliance. Soviet ammunition development followed similar paths, though driven by different wartime experiences. The 7.62x3 9mm intermediate cartridge used in the AK-47 and the 7.62x54 mmR used in the SVD rifle, both employed spitzer projectiles with penetration characteristics superior to World War II era. German ammunition, Soviet testing, conducted in the late 1940s and early 1950s, evaluated ammunition performance against typical European construction, which meant German and Eastern European buildings captured during the Soviet Cold advance. Cold War-era military manuals from both sides explicitly discussed barrier penetration as a key characteristic of infantry ammunition. NATO training materials taught soldiers to expect their rifles to penetrate standard building materials at combat ranges. Soviet bloc training emphasized the same capability. The requirement that infantry ammunition must defeat these barriers was taken as fundamental, obvious, not worth extensive explanation. But it wasn't obvious in 1944. It had been learned, painfully, by German soldiers who discovered too late that the walls their doctrine told them would protect them were transparent to American rifles. The M1 Garand that fired those penetrating rounds survives today in museums and private collections across America. Many veterans brought them home as souvenirs after the war, taking advantage of programs that allowed soldiers to purchase their service weapons. Their heavy rifles, weighing 9.5 pounds empty, elegantly machined, beautifully balanced. Collectors admire the craftsmanship, the distinctive ping of the ejecting N-block clip, the smooth operation of the gas piston system that John Garand designed in the 1930 seconds. The rifles sit in display cases and gun safes, maintained carefully, sometimes still fired at ranges by enthusiasts who appreciate their historical significance and mechanical elegance. Almost none of the collectors or historians who preserve these weapons know that this rifle's most significant tactical advantage in World War II was something John Garand never designed for, something Army Ordnance never advertised, something that emerged accidentally from engineering decisions made to optimize other performance characteristics. A pointed bullet, a bonded jacket, a slightly different approach to projectile construction, nothing revolutionary. Nothing that would impress ordnance engineers or warrant press releases. The M2 ball cartridge development in the late 1930 seconds focused on accuracy at range and consistency in terminal ballistics. The engineers at Frankfurt Arsenal weren't thinking about penetrating Norman farmhouse walls or German brick buildings. They were optimizing for target shooting performance and meeting military specifications for effective range and stopping power. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, against the stone walls of France, those subtle differences rewrote the tactical equations of infantry combat. They turned buildings from strongpoints into traps. They made cover into concealment. They taught an entire generation of German soldiers that the walls couldn't protect them anymore. Hauptmann Köhler, who'd abandoned that nameless hamlet on July 12th, never knew that his experience was being replicated simultaneously across 100 kilometers of front. He never knew that reports of his company's collapse had contributed to a technical analysis that recommended ammunition Germany couldn't produce in time. He never knew that the neat hole punched through Georg Steinmetz's wall had become a data point in ordnance studies that would influence ammunition design for the next 60 years. He knew only that the walls hadn't been thick enough, that American rifles had killed his men through barriers German doctrine said were safe, that when he'd ordered his company to withdraw from positions they should have held, he hadn't been wrong, the doctrine had been wrong. The walls had failed because someone, somewhere in the American ordnance system, had made different engineering choices when designing ammunition, choices that seemed minor on specification sheets, but were lethal in the specific tactical environment of 1944 France. Köhler died near Falaise in August, still fighting, still trying to hold positions that couldn't be held. He died believing, probably, that Germany had lost because of overwhelming enemy numbers and resources, the standard explanation offered at every level of German military thinking. He never understood that sometimes wars are decided by subtleties, by engineering differences measured in millimeters and jacket construction techniques, by the cumulative effect of thousands of tactical engagements, where one side's ammunition performed slightly better against barriers than the other side's. That lesson, learned in blood and limestone fragments, became the foundation of modern understanding about infantry weapons and urban warfare. The penetration requirement, now built into every military rifle specification, traces back to those July days in 1944 when American riflemen discovered their Garands could shoot through walls and German soldiers discovered their walls weren't thick enough. The physics were always there. The ballistics were predictable if anyone had thought to test them comprehensively before the war. The engineering was straightforward once someone identified it as a requirement. But in 1944, this knowledge existed only in scattered fragments. American soldiers learning it through trial and error in hedgerow combat, German soldiers learning it through casualties and abandoned positions, ordnance specialists on both sides eventually documenting it in technical reports that arrived too late to matter. Someone had to learn it the hard way. In the history of military technology, someone always does. The difference between ammunition that penetrates walls and ammunition that doesn't seems minor until you're the soldier crouching behind that wall, trusting your life to doctrine that promised you'd be safe, or learning in the last seconds of your life that the doctrine was wrong. That knowledge, purchased with German casualties across the battlefields of France, became the inheritance of every military that came after. The NATO standards, the Soviet specifications, the ammunition that fills magazines in rifles across the world today. All of it traces back to the moment when Wilhelm Brandt watched an American round punch through solid limestone and understood that everything he'd been taught about cover was obsolete. The walls weren't thick enough. They never would be again. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.